He was out by the fence line before dawn, kneeling in the chill and pressing slender poplar whips into the stubborn earth. The green sticks looked like little more than garden stakes against a sprawling horizon of stubble and sky, each one a promise without proof. Across the road, a neighbor's truck crept by, window down, the farmer's face creased with a mixture of puzzlement and pity. "That Thompson boy's got his mother's head in the clouds," someone whispered at the grain elevator, watching him work as the sun cut through the mist. Kids on their way to the bus stop pointed and laughed, wagering how long before the wind snapped all his sticks in half. Even his own father, trudging past with a feed sack, paused, torn between pride and the old ache of worry that the world would be too hard on a boy this gentle, this strange. But the boy's focus never shifted to the watchers. Each sapling set was a careful, hopeful motion. Only he knew what he was building, a green border where emptiness met home, a fragile hedge against a future no one else seemed able to imagine. And in that quiet, the stage was set for a question that would echo for months. What was he really planting, and would it mean anything at all when storms rolled in? The town of Mercy Hill sat hunched in a cradle of wind-brushed fields and silvered grain bins, its streets barely wide enough for an old tractor to turn. Life here was measured by bushels and rainfall, by the number of hands strong enough to mend a fence or harvest a field before the sky went dark. Most yards were kept plain, a few scraggly lilacs, maybe a shade tree or two, but never a row of something just for beauty's sake. Neatness was a matter of pride, practicality. The unspoken law residents traded weather-worn advice at the co-op, recalling the tornado of '92 that tore the high school roof off and left barns flattened for miles. Nature's reminder that nothing truly lasted if it wasn't needed. Wind shaped everything, which crops survived, how barns leaned, even how neighbors greeted each other on Main Street. The boy's father, like most men in town, was a quiet sentinel of reputation and land. Losing a crop to storms was painful. Being thought a fool for wasting seed and effort on unproven projects cut even deeper. Every dollar planted in something that didn't feed or shelter, every poplar slip pressed along that fence line, was a gamble not just with money but with the fragile thread of family pride, all while the memory of past disasters shadowed each thunderhead on the horizon. Long before he planted the first poplar, the boy's world was shaped by green. His earliest memory, the cool hush beneath the giant cottonwood in his grandmother's backyard, light flickering through leaves as she read aloud stories of forests and heroes. She taught him how to cradle saplings in his palm, how roots needed both water and faith to take hold. Evenings, they walked the yard together, circling the old lilac hedge, her gentle hand on his shoulder as she pointed out the way trees leaned into the wind but rarely broke. When illness took her, the house felt bare and the fields emptier. He missed the pockets of peace she'd found everywhere, even in storms. Her words, "Plant for the years you might never see," stayed with him, turning every fallen seed or sapling rescued from the ditch into a secret vow. Trees, he decided, weren't just for shade or shelter. They were living monuments to patience and hope, protection against the world's harshness and proof that beauty wasn't wasted, even if it took years to show its worth. In each straight row of poplars, he chased that memory, determined to build something lasting from what she'd left behind. By early summer, the teasing had grown sharper. At the co-op, neighbors joked loud enough for the boy's father to hear, planting a forest for the birds or for his future firewood. Some speculated on how much better the edge would look with more beans instead of fancy sticks. Even his older cousins laughed over family supper, recounting the tornado that had sent a neighbor's maple barreling through 3 fences. "Wind will do what it wants," his uncle muttered, shaking his head. At home, his mother tried to soften the sting of the talk, but questioned softly if the time and water spent on those little trees might be precious next year for corn. Yet the boy pressed on, inspecting each sapling for signs of growth, weaving lattice from hay twine to steady the slender trunks. whispering encouragement as clouds thickened on the western edge of the sky. It was the season everyone braced for. Tractors fueled, windows taped, storm radios checked and rechecked. Still, each time thunder rumbled, the old men at the diner only shrugged. Twisters come for whoever they want, trees or not. And so, as wind began to lean harder against empty barns and old scars of past storms ached anew, no one, not even his family, gave his planted hedge a second thought. One muggy afternoon, as thunderheads stacked above the fields, the boy waited out a downpour in the tiny county library. He wandered the stacks, rain hammering the roof, his mind restless with worry and hope. There, tucked in the back between farm manuals and folklore, he found a sun-faded book on Shelterbelts, pages filled with black and white photos of Dust Bowl farms, thick rows of trees turning back walls of wind and saving fields from ruin. He pored over diagrams showing poplars lined along property edges, arrows tracing the force of storms, diverted, houses and barns left standing when everything else was toppled. Suddenly the memory of his grandmother's hand steadying saplings, whispering, "Every little bit fights disaster," clicked into place. The poplars, he realized, weren't just beautiful or sentimental. Planted right, grown tall, they could shield his family from the worst heart-quickening. He copied planting plans into his notebook, making notes for extra rows, new bracing, and careful spacing for strength. Outside, the first sirens of tornado season began to wail faintly in the next county. The boy hurried home, eyes alight with a mixture of new conviction and fear. He would double down, do everything right, and trust that what he was building might be the difference between shelter and ruin when the sky finally broke. With a sense of purpose he'd never felt before, the boy set to work with borrowed tools and farmer's knuckles scraped raw by wire and dirt. Each dawn he dug new holes for extra poplar whips, hauling water and battered milk jugs across furrows deep with last season's roots. He lashed young trunks together with twine, hammered spare fence posts in place against the prevailing wind, and gently straightened any sapling bending too far. When the wind snapped a branch, he pruned it clean and pressed a new cutting into the soil. Some days, heat shimmered so fierce that leaves drooped by noon, and he'd pour the last drops of rainwater over the roots, whispering apologies and promises to hold on. Neighbors passed without waving. A few made bets at the grain elevator on how many trees would make it to the fall. His brothers groaned at muddy boots in the kitchen. His mother counted empty water buckets with worry, but his father watched at dusk from the porch, silent for reasons the boy could almost but not quite understand. Each setback stung, yet, with every shoot that took, hope slipped a little deeper into the land. By midsummer, the hedge was more than a line. It was a living fence where birds perched in shade and rabbits hid from the sun. Alone most mornings, he saw the first signs of what only he and once upon a time his grandmother had ever believed, that sometimes the hardest work for the future grows quietly, unnoticed, until the day it's finally needed. It happened just before supper, when the sky churned green and the wind roared low like a freight train rounding the grain bins. Sirens wailed as families scrambled to cellars, radios crackling with updates and prayers tumbling from every mouth. The world narrowed to rumble, rattle, splinter. When the storm passed, daylight broke into a strange, bruised calm. Fields stretched away in chaos, corn flattened, tin twisted in the trees. A neighbor's barn roof peeled back like a sardine can. Fences were blown flat. Wood and sheet metal littered the ditches. Yet at the edge of the boy's land, a miracle remained. The row of poplars, battered but standing, leaves shivering in the wind's wake. Behind the living barrier, his family's home stood untouched, the garden safe, their old dog dozing on a porch that hadn't lost a single shingle. Word rippled fast. Neighbors with ruined fields soon realized which houses had been spared, the ones shielded by the boy's patchwork windbreak. People drove by in silence, then stopped. Some wept, others hugged the boy or pressed his hand. Doubters became awed by week's end. The town's woodlots were combed for spare saplings. Neighbors asked for his planting maps, his advice on knots and spacing. In the weeks that followed, the talk at church picnics and the feed store changed from laughter to gratitude. The pretty poplars were spoken of as a blessing, his family's risk now the hope of the whole town, proof that what begins in doubt can shelter a harvest for generations. Throughout the following season, neighbors arrived with shovel and sapling, some bringing their children to learn as the boy shared the lessons written in sweat and windburn across his knuckles. His once lonely row of poplars became the backbone of a new tradition. Living fences sprouted along every edge of Mercy Hill, laughter and stories echoing through the shade. His mother's uncertainty gave way to pride each time she watched her son patiently teaching grown men how to brace a trunk or test the wind. The boy, once shy and unsteady, now stood tall beside his father as they led teams on planting days, his confidence blooming beneath the open sky. At school, classmates who'd once teased him followed his lead, drawing plans for tree belts and shelter gardens. Family suppers grew longer, filled with new stories of resilience and old tales retold beneath the rustling poplar leaves. In months, the scars of the tornado faded beneath a bright fringe of green, and hearts throughout Mercy Hill mended right alongside the battered land. Each root that spread carried the boy's dream into another season, proof that small hands and dogged hope can build a legacy far sturdier than any fence of wire and wood. Somewhere between practicality and hope, true wisdom waits in the hands of those who see beyond the immediate yield. The boy who planted poplars for beauty taught his entire community what it means to trust in things that take time, green growing against the odds, protection that looks like art until the real test comes. Mercy Hill would remember that summer not just for the storm, but for the way one overlooked hedge turned aside disaster and changed the future. It became a story told at every bonfire and barn dance, a gentle reminder that forward thinking, even when mistaken for foolishness or vanity, often saves more than we expect. The living walls of poplars rose as proof that just in case can become thank goodness in the blink of a wind-shattered evening. As folks here like to say, plant for the storm you hope never comes, and you might end up saving the world. Have you ever planted something or started a project everyone else thought was just for show, only to watch it turn vital when least expected? Share your story in the comments, along with where you're watching from. Subscribe to join this circle of dreamers and doers, because what the world calls unnecessary today may be the very shelter that saves a home tomorrow.